Hello, I'm Jamon Jordan, official historian for the city of Detroit. And this is Black History Month. I want to welcome you to some wonderful programming called Undefeated, a look at Black history in the city of Detroit through the lens of dance, music, architecture, spoken word, and other genres. You can view some wonderful video, which will also be available on Channel 22 and at DetroitArtsandCulture.com. Please enjoy.
I am so thrilled to be here at the Henry Ford, which is an amazing museum that is for all of us in Michigan, but particularly those of us in Detroit, who I am so happy will be able to come over more and more and see things that mean so much to us. And nothing right now means more than this amazing Mandela exhibit. Christo Brand was 19 years old in 1978 when he spent his first night guarding one of the most influential people of the past century. So was I. In 1978, I was a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill who had never heard of apartheid, which was so much like the Jim Crow laws that so many Americans had fought against here. That this young man, a world away, was learning the lessons that I was learning back here from a man he came to know and respect and who inspired millions in America was the hallmark of Nelson Mandela's legacy. Apartheid, as you know, was a legal system that existed in South Africa from 1948 to 1994. It instituted racial segregation under an all-white government of South Africa, which dictated that non-white South Africans, a majority of the population, were required to live in separate areas from whites and had to use separate public facilities and had limited contact between the two groups. Apartheid was unheard of by so many folks my age in other parts of the world, despite a struggle that had been going on since the 1950s. The global anti-apartheid movement gained ground in the 1970s. The US anti-apartheid movement gained rapid momentum after the Soweto uprising of 1976. This was a series of student-led demonstrations. And the Congressional Black Caucus helped establish a Black American foreign policy organization called Trans-Africa in 1977. Some of you will remember that. Led by the late Randall Robinson, Trans-Africa organized protest movements across the United States, including demonstrations outside the South African embassy that resulted in 5,000 Americans being arrested. Trans-Africa became the largest anti-apartheid organizer in the United States, and its work helped result in companies and governments ending investment in South Africa. As we know, money talks. Universities, banks, businesses, and local governments withdrew their economic ties to South Africa. And I was just learning about Nelson Mandela. But soon, my friends and I joined college students around the country speaking out to help this warrior, this young lawyer who had been fighting for years to end apartheid and who was finally jailed in 1964, sentenced to life in prison, sleeping on a concrete floor, labeled a terrorist, and allowed one 30-minute visit with a single person every year. Nelson Mandela had been sleeping on that concrete floor for 14 years before I was shouting his name. That this 19-year-old young man that you're going to hear from now would spend those 14 years learning the true Mandela and becoming a family friend is a testament to what Nelson Mandela did, who he was, and what he continues to stand for. When I stood outside Mandela's cell on Robben Island 10 years ago, I could not go in. I felt that it was sacred ground. And when I watched him become president of the country that he fought so hard to make what it could be, I celebrated along with millions and millions of others. But only one person can speak to those torturous years in Mandela's life when he changed who he was, changed how things would be changed without violence, and the power of forgiveness. I welcome you now to a conversation with the one who knew him and one who shares his lessons, our two guests, The Conversation.
Thank you, Rochelle. Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Don't judge me by my successes, but by how many times I fell down and got back up again. it felt appropriate to begin this conversation with Mandela's words himself. Welcome, everybody. My name's Lucy Howell. I'm the Chief Learning Officer and Director of our Learning and Engagement Programs here at the Henry Ford, and it is my absolute honor and privilege to moderate this conversation on Mandela's legacy of leadership and friendship with our guests today, Christo Brand and Andrew Russell. Christo Brand is the author of Doing Life with Mandela, My Prisoner and My Friend. Christo's early childhood was spent on a small farm outside of Sanford, where his father was a foreman. He went to a small school on a nearby farm from the age of about 5 years old. The nearest bus stop was 5 miles from his house. One of the farm workers, a black man called Chocolate, would walk Christo to and from that bus stop. Life was tough. The family had no luxuries, no electricity. Evenings were spent listening to Christo's dad playing the violin and Chocolate playing the guitar. At the age of 12, his father developed pneumonia, and the family were forced to leave the farm and move to his uncle's house in Paro Valley. I think I got that right. Christo started working on the weekends as a builder. Rather than joining the army for his national service, which was compulsory for every white South African male, Christo decided to join the prison service, and after a year of training, he applied for a post at Robben Island, which was closer to home. At the age of 19, he got that post. That was in 1978. Christo first came across Nelson Mandela, who at the time was 60 years old, when he joined that prison service. And this is where they formed a relationship which was to become so much more. A close friendship that was built on trust and mutual respect for one another. In 1982, Mandela was transferred to Pollsmoor prison, and that same year, Christo married his wife, Estelle, who's here with us today. On his release, Mandela organized a job for Christo as an administrative and logistics manager in the Constitutional Assembly. And the book that is to the side today is a really interesting insight into friendship, respect, and understanding. Please welcome Christo Brand.
Thank you.
Andrew Russell is the author of the second book we have here today, The Leadership We Need, Lessons for Today from Nelson Mandela. He's also editor of the updated and expanded edition of Christo Brand's book, both of them published by Blue Ear Books. Andrew was born in Cape Town in 1964. He completed his education at Bishop's College and the University of Cape Town. After completing a Bachelor in Communications degree and a postgraduate diploma in Human Resources and a high school teaching diploma, he did his national service, and then he taught accounting at high school for about 8 years before taking the big risk of starting his own tourism business. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. In July 2018, Christo Brand asked Andrew to be his business manager, and they set out on an exciting adventure into the unknown to introduce the world to Christo and to share his story. Andrew is a passionate and fanatical South African, mad keen on sport, and the proud dad of 2 children, Daniel and Abigail. Whenever possible, they meet up to watch their national rugby, we'll talk about that in a minute too, and cricket sides. Please welcome Andrew Russell. Okay, Christo, my first question's for you. So here at the Henry Ford, we believe in the power of place, and it's important in setting context for the stories of history we share. The first part of your book focuses on your childhood, growing up initially in rural South Africa and then moving to sort of the suburbs and city. In your book, you share that to some degree, this mirrored some of Nelson Mandela's own childhood, which can be experienced in the exhibit behind us. Can you share with us a little bit about your childhood and help us understand a bit more about South Africa and the place that you come from?
You know, I grew up on a farm where I was the only white child playing with African children. My father was just a foreman. We was very poor. And one day I was disrespectful to an elderly African man when my father gave me a hiding and said to me, the person can be black, but a human being like us. We must respect each other as human beings. He always said to me, in front of God, we are all the same colors. We must respect. But many years later, my father get pneumonia on the farm. They move us off the farm. We moved to the city. In the city, I stayed in a suburb which was for whites only. I didn't have any more black friends to play with. I didn't understand it that much. I was 12 years old when we moved there. But when I landed up in the school was only for whites also. And when I was in grade 12, one of my best friends was called up for military service. And that year, like you said, was compulsory for all white males in South Africa to join the military service. And that day when I see my friend off on Cape Town station, he said to me, you not really want to join the military. You don't want to fight black people in the townships. That year, the military operate in our townships. You don't want to fight black people on the borders. You want to become a medical doctor. But the government said he must first serve 2 years of his life for the military. So my friend was sent for his training. After his training, was sent to the borders and was killed by so-called terrorists. And that day when we sit in that church, the priest said what hero this gentleman was for our country. How this gentleman protect our country against the black enemy. For me, sit in the church, my friend was not a hero. The blacks was not my enemy. And I made a decision I will look for something alternative. And that's where I start joining up the prison service, because that was exemption from military service.
So can you share a little bit about like how that made you feel when you were wondering about choosing the prison service or choosing to go into military service? What was your thinking and feeling behind that?
You know, when I joined the prison service, I was thinking I'm going to look after big criminals, criminal prisoners, and guard them. But when I landed on an island, they told us we're going to meet the biggest criminals in the history of South Africa. They tell us these guys in this prison got life sentences. Some of them have double life sentences. We're here to break the spirit of these guys. These guys is here to do hard labor. We're not allowed to talk or communicate with him. We're just here to give instructions. You know, but when I opened that first cell door that morning, I see elderly African man stand up from the floor. He slept on 2 mats, 3 blankets. It was terribly cold that morning. He stand bare feet, short pants, short sleeves on the cold cement. And he greeted me with respect, good morning, sir. I was shocked to see such an old man in prison. I look at his face, I look at his arms, I don't see any tattoos on him. Because during my training, I was trained with really big gangsters, full of tattoos in their faces. But this guy is clean. So I just greet the old man with respect. So then I read the names on the doors: Andrew Mlangeni, Walter Sisulu, Raymond Muslaba, Nelson Mandela. I never heard these names before in my life. I asked the sergeant, what is this criminal's in for? Because I don't see tattoos on him. His answer to me was, he said, Brandt, that's a terrorist to try to overthrow our country. That's a terrorist to kill our young boys on the borders. Immediately I feel I must hate these guys, but when I look at the age of these guys, I can't believe they can be terrorists. They humble, treat me with respect and humanity.
And remind us again, how old were you when you met Nelson Mandela?
When I started work on Robben Island, I was 18 that year. 3 months later, I became 19. You can see it when I first speak to Mandela for the first time, I was 19 years old. And he was 60 years old that year.
So that sort of leads me to the next question, because as you read your book, you become friends, you build up a relationship, and you're 19 and he's 60. Can you share a little bit about in what ways you connected? And I know a bit of your background was where you connected on.
You know, the day when we connected, that was about 3 months after I was already on the island. That was a morning when I take him to the visiting center. I put him on leg irons, I walk him down to the visiting center. That morning when I walked him down, after a while he looked back to me. He asked me, Mr. Brandt, where are you come from? You put a leg iron smooth around my ankles, you lift up the chains for me, and you treat me with respect. I look at him, I said, Mandela, I grew up on a farm. And my father said, I must respect elderly people. His answer was immediately, that is good news, Mr. Brandt. You can help me, give me advice in my prison garden. In a prison courtyard, you have a small piece of land where you plant some chilies, tomatoes, onions to spice up the bad food. I didn't comment on that. Then we walked on, then he asked me, Mr. Brandt, is your parents still alive? I said, yes. He said, send him my greetings. That was very strange for me. I didn't comment on that either. When we get at the visiting center, he looked at me again. He asked me, Mr. Brandt, are you studying? I said, no. He said, you must make use of the time to study. Studies is the future of your country. Through studies, you can become the head of the prison, and you can understand us as prisoners better. That was the first time I speak really with Nelson Mandela. But that morning, I must fetch the visitors from the boat, you know. And that year, all the prison guards on Robben Island was white. All the prisoners was black, colored of Indian. You call it mixed race in your country. But the visitors was also black, colored of Indian. And that morning, when I marched the visitors to the boat, I see the one lady take off the raincoat, she take off a blanket, she take off a backpack, but it was not a backpack, but a baby infant. And prisoners was not allowed to see children. So we take her to the waiting room. We informed her we're supposed to cancel a visit, but she was still begging us, we must try to get permission from our superiors, which I said I will find out. But when she's in a cubicle, the baby was in the waiting room, she immediately told her husband through the double glass on the telephone that she had brought his grandchild to Robben Island. That moment, Mandela looked back to me. He begged me, please, Mr. Brandt, is it possible just to see the infant through the window? Which I said to him at that occasion, Mandela, you know the prison regulations. You're not allowed to see a child. Everything was recorded for national intelligence and security branch. I could have not otherwise. But at the end of the visit, Mandela had a request again, after his wife had been taken back to the waiting room, that he must please pass a message to his wife. And that moment, my superior came down the aisle, very upset about the delay, explaining what Mandela requested. And he said to me, Brandt, fetch his wife back. Let he can tell him himself. That moment, when I walked to the waiting room, there was rotation of visitors. And I knew the tape recorders were switched off. And I walked to her side. She was sitting in a corner. And I said, ma'am, can't I hold her baby? I never held the African child. She pushed it to my arm. She grabbed the handbag. She tried to bribe me of some money. I said, ma'am, I'm not going to take your money. I'm not allowed to show the baby to your husband. I will just keep it for you. But please go back into the visiting booth. She was still begging me. But when she's in the visiting booth, Mandela passed his message to his wife. I sneaked to the side of Mandela. After she passed the message, the window closed. Winnie Mandela was on that side locked up. And Mandela see me in a passage with a baby. And that moment when he see me, the tears comes out of his eyes. And he walked to me, and he take the baby out of my arms and kiss the child twice. And he become more emotional. That same moment, Winnie Mandela knocked on the door, she's locked in. I quickly take the baby back from him, wipe the tears from the cheeks of the baby, go to her side, apologize, and gave her the infant back. She was still begging me to show him the child. His answer was no. That secret was between me and Mandela for nearly 20 years, till he became the president of our country.
So you allowed him to see his child, but it was a secret. And you kept that secret for 20 years?
For 20 years, and now about 4 weeks ago, that child have passed. She was very sick of cancer, she have passed.
Thank you so much for sharing that story.
Thank you.
I think in a similar part of the book, I seem to remember there's a quote that actually really hit me hard, and it is this: it was impossible not to be drawn to him, this powerful leader of men facing a lifetime of hard labor, of isolation, seemingly without bitterness or anger. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? How do you think he was able to think in that way and be that kind of leader in that place?
You know, there was times in prison when I asked Mandela, did you never give up hope for sitting in these cells every time? He said, Mr. Brandt, I never gave up hope. Every time when new people get in prison, and I hear the uprisings outside, and hear the blood is still flowing, give me more strength in this prison. I knew we will fight the struggle, we will win the struggle, even if I died in prison. But my comrades will win the struggle. He was always positive about that. You know, and he was in prison, there was young prisoners planned to escape. And he tell the prisoners in a note which was caught up in prison. On a note he said, comrades, we never escape from this place. The longer we stay in this place, the more we prepare us for freedom. We educate ourselves. But remember, if you escape and the police arrested you, you will be tortured till death. How can you fight the struggle if you're dead? He was always positive in that way. There was a time in 1986 when he wanted to resign the prison service, and I discussed it with him. And he said, Mr. Brandt, if you resign from this, we will really miss your face. Because you are the person, let us always be friendly with us. You are the person, let us always believe there's a world outside the prison bars. So we become a good friendship in prison.
Yeah, I hear in a lot of your answers, you talk about him referring to you as Mr. Brandt and how you refer to him. I hear a lot of kindness and respect in that language and those stories.
You know, Mandela was a person treat people with respect. Like I was 18, 19 years old, he was 60 years old. And even the guards who treat him bad, he will treat with respect. He was a person when one day in a passage was a kitchen that night, and the passage must be cleaned. I asked him, Mandela, I say, somebody who can clean for me. He go on his knees and he's cleaned and washed and polished the floor. He was that humble person. When he became president, he was exactly the same. There was one morning when he walked out of his office. When he walked out, he kneeled down to pick up a cigarette butt where the security was throwing it around. So after that, they always cleaned in front of his office. When he walked in his presidential garden, the first day when he walked out there, the garden ran away. And he called his security immediately, please go and fetch that man for me. And that guy was worried, what did he done wrong? When Mandela called him, Mandela said to him, my friend, you are one of the hard workers here. You are the one who made this place beautiful for me. You are very important here. I don't want you to run away and fear me. I'm just a normal person. But I want to thank you every time when I walk in here, what beautiful job you do for me. Even in the passages in Parliament, when the people try to run into the office, he will call them out to greet them, because he said he must greet the people who work for him. They are very important.
Thank you so much. I think this is a good point to bring Andrew into the conversation. Andrew, your book, The Leadership We Need, Lessons for Today from Nelson Mandela, focuses on the lessons of leadership that come from Nelson Mandela's legacy. Would you share with us how you got connected into this story and to Christo?
Yeah, so thank you very much for having us here. It's an absolute privilege to talk to you. I was born in 1964, and in fact, I was 11 days old when Nelson Mandela made his famous speech, which is here in the exhibition, which he finished with, "It's a cause for which I'm prepared to die." And I finished school in 1982, which was the year that Nelson Mandela moved off the island. So many years later, my paths crossed with Christo when I had a group who had come over from Canada to South Africa. And they had met Christo on the island. 2 years later, they came back and they asked me to arrange for Christo to meet them. And then what happened was I got to know Christo and started hearing these amazing stories. But at the same time, I'd always wanted to write a book about Nelson Mandela's leadership. And then what happened was the pandemic, and we were all forced into lockdown. And suddenly I had the opportunity to start reading and researching and really starting to answer some of the questions that I'd always had in my mind. And so I was then able to put together a book on the lessons that we can all learn from Nelson Mandela. My starting point was that I just believed there was such a dearth of world leaders at that time anywhere on the planet. And so what I called Nelson Mandela, I called him the default setting for world leadership. And I just believed he was the person that we needed to go back to in order to try and understand what were some of the lessons that we can all take from his life. Not to try and become Mandelas ourselves, but for each of us just to take some things from his life. And if we all take a few things from his life into our own lives, at school or at work or in our communities, then hopefully the world will become a better place. So that was the premise for my book.
Thanks for sharing that. I used to, I think when Nelson Mandela passed, I posted something on Facebook which was around having a Mandela moment and actually thinking about times when you actually, in your own life, hold other people in respect and hope and hear their side, be able to hear what they have to say. So here at the Henry Ford, we are surrounded by stories of ordinary people who do extraordinary things, whether it's Rosa Parks or Thomas Edison or George Washington Carver or Henry Ford himself. And we think about the habits that they practiced as innovators and change makers of their time. Andrew, just staying with you for a moment, when you think about Nelson Mandela as a leader, whether as a man, a prisoner, or a president, what two leadership habits did he practice that you would like to see the leaders in us practice today?
So the first remarkable thing about Nelson Mandela, he had spent 27 years in prison. During that time, there were 2 massacres of his people, and many of the people killed in those massacres were young children and women. I found it most remarkable that when Mandela came out of prison, he had every single reason to choose revenge on the white people of South Africa. But instead, he chose reconciliation. And if there's any lesson that I believe, that to me is the primary lesson. Not only did he choose reconciliation with those people who put him away in prison, but he actually forgave them for what they had done to him. And that is different level leadership, where you can forgive someone. Mandela was living in Johannesburg. He owned the first black law firm in South Africa. He was married to Winnie Mandela, one of the most beautiful women on the African continent. He had a family, he had a career, he had everything going for him. And he gave it all up to go to prison because in his heart he knew that his people weren't free. And yet when he came out of prison, he chose to forgive those people. So I would say that is the first one that really stands out for me as a leader. Obviously, there were a lot of different roles that I chose from Mandela in my book, but the second one is his perseverance. You know, and if there's anything any of us can take from Mandela's life, it's about perseverance. It's about never, ever giving up, despite the hurdles that are in our way. He spent 27 years in prison. He never gave up on his dream for a free and democratic South Africa. And remarkably, when he came out of prison, within 5 years, he was able to take part in the first ever election in South Africa where people of all race groups could vote. The African National Congress won the election because until 1994, only whites had been allowed to vote in elections in South Africa. So this was the first election where everyone could vote. And remarkably, without surprise, Nelson Mandela became our president, our first democratically elected president. So that to me also was just this perseverance. And you know what kept Mandela's perseverance alive in prison was people like Christo Brandt. Because Christo was one of the guys who was closest to Mandela, treated him so well, and so through Christo, Nelson Mandela came to understand what made the Afrikaans people tick in South Africa. So when he came out of prison, he understood those people because he had spent so much time in prison getting to know Christo. So those two things, the ability to forgive people, and secondly, this incredible perseverance, just to never give up and to make his dream come true.
Yeah, I think that speaks to whenever you meet someone new, just meeting them for the person that they are and trying not to bring your thoughts, your biases, your history with others into that conversation. I hear a lot of words like respect in this, perseverance, forgiveness. So that has me thinking about the legacy as we move into the future of leadership. And as I think about what challenges we have today that perhaps President Mandela didn't have as a leader, like engaging through social media or communicating with all of that noise around us. What leadership habits do you think he had that could help us through those pieces? Andrew?
You know, I've been asked this before. His leadership qualities are timeless. You know, there's things like humility, like being prepared to serve other people. When he came out of prison, his first speech he made on the balcony of the City Hall in Cape Town, and he said, I now place the rest of my years in your hands. I'm here to serve you, the people. So that was what he did. He served other people. He was never in it for himself. You know, he was always looking at the other person. So those kind of things like he had, humility, perseverance, commitment, all of those qualities of Mandela are timeless. You know, and as I unpacked these lessons more and more, and the more I read about him, and the more I realized, you know what, leaders, when he became president, he said, I'm only going to stand for one term. I will do one term as president, and then I'm out of here. So he was prepared to give up power after only one term. Christo tells a story as well. Mandela received a lot of money and donations when he was president. He said, I can't do anything with this money. He said, I want to build schools for children. I want to use it for HIV research. So he was always thinking of the other person. So those leadership qualities, which I believe Mandela had, they are timeless. And I believe they apply in every single leader today, even each of us. And what I say to people is, you know, every single one of us is a leader. Every single one, by doing the small things. And that's what Christo often spoke about. Just when you go into the supermarket and you're paying for just to greet the person and to ask them how they are, you know, don't feel you are any more important than anyone else. Because just around the corner, there's a fall for all of us. And, you know, one little story, when Nelson Mandela met the Queen for the first time, he met Queen Elizabeth, who you know is only allowed to be called Her Majesty. He called her Elizabeth. His advisors called him in that evening and said to him, President Mandela, we need to discuss the protocol. You need to call her Her Majesty. His reply was, you know what? She called me Nelson, so I called her Elizabeth. She wasn't the Queen of England to him. She was just another human being. And if there's a timeless lesson from Mandela, it's just to treat everyone the same. And that's what he did with the Queen. That's what he did with every single person that he met.
Thank you for that story. The Brit in me really appreciates.
You know, Mandela said also, the more you give away for other people, help each others in life, the more you'll be blessed with good life. And I believe all the things you have inherited over the years, he gave it away for orphanage, children, the Mandela Hospital, the Nelson Mandela Foundation. There was no money for people to inherit when he passed. So he at least reached the age of 95. So I believe the more you give away, the more you will be helped with good life. That's always he said.
Yeah, I think, you know, what keeps hitting me in this conversation is around the humility piece, the forgiveness piece, the looking to help other people. And, you know, the original question was about social media and communication and the way in which we exist today. And, you know, I start to think that really social media is just another channel. And what you're saying is just approach that channel in the same way as you would approach that, you know, as though those people there are real life human beings, and treat them in the same way as you would if they were in person. Okay, so my last question is going to come to Christo. Christo, during some of our previous conversations, you shared with me that Nelson Mandela placed importance as a leader and a man on education, respect, and hard work. If he were here with us today, what advice do you think he would give to young people and emerging leaders about education, respect, and hard work?
No, he will tell the people to educate themselves. Through education, you can change the world because you can change people around you. And people around you can also start getting better jobs and things like that. And humanity, treat people humane and with humanity. And that was he was saying always. And he was a person who will reach out to people. You know, like I said, when I have money, he will go out to people. One day I give a person the money on the street. And he said, Mr. Brandt, it's a wrong thing you've done. If you should have reached out to that person, help him with some food, or help him with some accommodation. But the best thing you can help that person is education. And he always believed in that.
Thank you so much. So we're going to close out our conversation and move into our question and answer session. But before we do that, I just want to share a personal story and the reason why I was so excited to moderate this amazing conversation. I grew up in Africa, not South Africa, but in one of a couple of the countries nearby. Apartheid and its impacts were things that I was really aware of as a young child. I also became a rugby fan, England, as you can probably tell by my accent, of course. And these two things intersected in 1995. Andrew, as a sports fan, I think you might know where I'm going with this. But in 1995, South Africa was allowed to host its first international sports competition in decades because apartheid had ended. President Mandela had been in office for less than a year. South Africa is a huge rugby nation, specifically white South Africa at the time. And the team really wasn't meant to do very well at all. But President Mandela saw an opportunity, and he supported this team that was highly supported by white South Africans. He particularly supported their captain, Francois Pienaar, to really think and dream big. The team went on to win the entire competition. As an England fan, I watched in a mix of frustration and, frankly, awe. And I actually remember feeling, there was this feeling that it was just meant to be. There was some kind of magic that happened in that World Cup. Well, a few weeks ago, it was the final of the 2023 Rugby World Cup, for those of you who are not rugby fans. South Africa came face-to-face in the final with the same team as the team they faced in 1995, the New Zealand All Blacks. For those of you who know a little bit about rugby, they are the ones that do the haka. South Africa won 2 weeks ago by 1 point. It felt like it was meant to be. The reason that I'm sharing this story is that President Mandela shared with the rugby captain in 1995 a poem that inspired his own leadership. This poem is called Invictus. It shares the same name as the movie that Matt Damon, Morgan Freeman star in, and Clint Eastwood directed. I believe it's in the giant screen right now, actually. So I thought before we got to questions, we might ask one of our Henry Ford Academy students to read the words that inspired Nelson Mandela, the man, the prisoner, and the president, to be the leader that he was. Please welcome to the stage Kennedy Files. She is a senior at Henry Ford Academy and a member of our Ford Legal Program.
Good afternoon, everyone. Invictus, William Ernest Henley. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever God may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeoning of chance, my head is bloody, but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms the horror of the shade, and yet the menace the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishment the stroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kennedy. That poem always brings a tear to my eye, so let me give me a moment. Okay, we are now going to go to question and answers. So hopefully, as the poem was being read, you were thinking of some of the questions you might have for our panel. And we'll be doing question and answers for about 10 minutes.
I would like to know the existence of whites that were living in Africa. And I want to know, was President Mandela, during the time he was in prison, allowed to teach or communicate with the younger Africans in Africa?
Yeah, so she was asking, was President Mandela allowed to interact or talk with the young people of South Africa when he was a prisoner? Was that right?
Yes, was he allowed to speak with the young Africans in prison or educate them also?
You know, in prison, in prison, Mandela always talked about education. There was one day when he wanted to put his Christmas order. That is a small order, he can order groceries. And he called me and said, Mr. Brandt, stop my order immediately. Please transfer this money to this prisoner. He needed more for education because he was registered at that time. He was the one who tried to get funding in from the outside, through church leaders, through his wife, Winnie Mandela, and through his lawyers, and when church people visit on Sundays. He must always talk about help each other with education. But when he was released from prison, he became the president. We visited a school one day, and he was so impressed to see black and white children playing together. And I said to him that day, President Mandela, when you take over the government, the schools is multiracial, open for all colors today. He said, Mr. Brandt, you're right. I'm very happy. This children is a rainbow nation I want to see develop in my country. But remember, we tried to change Robben Island into our university. We take over a government. We never run a government before. Somewhere in the line, my comrades going to fail, and we must educate this youth. They will be our future leaders of our country. So I believe that, and Mandela was a person, always talked to me, you must try to motivate people around you with education. You know, that was mostly the later years after the 85s.
What caused apartheid in South Africa?
Apartheid in South Africa was discrimination in color. There was townships only for blacks. There was areas only for whites, only areas for coloreds. That's mixed race people. And that was bring in 1948 in South Africa. There was laws in South Africa, apartheid laws like Liquor Act. Black people is not allowed to drink strong liquor like brandies or whiskies, only wines and beers. There was Morality Act. A white man is not allowed to give an African lady a lift, even in his pickup at the back, because then he can be charged for Morality Act. There was a lot of discrimination. There was even discrimination on the trains. At the back of the train was only third class, which was for blacks only. The front part, first class for whites only. There was all this discrimination from 1948 in South Africa. But when Mandela walked out of prison and with the first election, all that acts and things was scrapped in South Africa. We've got the equal opportunities in our country today. Blacks can move in any place where white people used to stay only, whites before. They can move in, they can buy houses there. Kids can go to any school, any university, where black students was not allowed to go to universities. There was only one university for blacks in Fort Hare, that years in South Africa. Today they can go to any university, any school, any public place, wherever they want to go to.
Andrew?
Sorry, ma'am, if I could just add a little bit there, just to give it, so from 1948, the government, which was a whites-only government, they actually passed laws, apartheid laws, which forbade blacks and coloreds from living in certain areas. So they declared certain areas whites only, and they moved blacks and coloreds into separate areas. So it really was a form of control by the white Afrikaans government. They tried to explain it away to the people by saying that it's better for people to grow up within their own communities. But ma'am, to answer your question, it was a legal system passed by law by the government. And that is why people like Nelson Mandela, when they went to trial in 1964, Mandela stood up and he said to the judge, I am going to defend myself in this trial because this government that we are accused of treason against does not represent my people because we never voted for it. It was only voted for by the whites of the country. So that was the system that was in place from 1948 until 1991. And as Christo says, then all the apartheid laws were repealed. There are now no more areas of segregation. People can live. There's freedom of movement, freedom of choice. But it was actually a legal system that was in place within South Africa.
And I want to add on that, you know, during that time of apartheid, all black people have a booklet which must carry on them. And that controls the lives of the black person in the country of birth. If you don't have the booklet on you, and they found you without a booklet, they put you in prison for 6 months without a trial. And that's where it happened one day in 1960, 21st of March 1960, where black people by one guy, Robert Sobukwe, said, all black people leave their stupid booklet at home. And we walked to the nearest police stations to hand ourselves over, that the police can arrest us. So the masses start walking in South Africa. In a police station called in Johannesburg, Sharpeville Police Station, masses have come to that small police station. They get frightened They start opening fire. They shot on that day 69 women and children dead, mostly from the back. For that gentleman was arrested, and he was for incitement arrested and put him in prison for 3 years.
I think it would also be helpful to share a little bit about sort of the tribes of South Africa. You mentioned the Afrikaans government. There was a British, sort of in the white tribe, there was British colonialism, and then a number of African tribes as well. Can you just share a little bit about like how many tribes make up South Africa and why the Rainbow Nation?
So the flag that I've got here on my scarf represents the new South Africa. So in South Africa, we have 11 official languages. And the sign language has now become the official 12th language in South Africa. So we actually have 12 different languages, which refers to the 12 different tribal groups that live within South Africa. So, that is what, when Christo spoke about the Rainbow Nation, that is what Mandela fought for. And that is what Desmond Tutu was, another person who fought for all his life, was for these people to all become part of one nation. And they came up with this beautiful phrase and called us the Rainbow Nation.
Yes, I'm enjoying the whole testimony of Nelson Mandela. I'd like to ask, in the discontinuation of apartheid, how was the wealth distribution contribute to the black people that worked in the diamond fields and the resources? Was the resources distribution of South Africa's wealth, was it given to the black people, or were their wages increased as of labor in the diamond mines?
So the wealth of the country, the diamond industry and the gold industry, was controlled and managed by the whites of South Africa. There's no secret about that. What happened since apartheid was demolished or got rid of was a system of black economic empowerment within South Africa. And this was a system whereby, because obviously what you have to understand is the blacks' education had been completely inferior all the way through apartheid. And now that schools were open for all races, it was going to still take quite a long time for people to be educated and for the blacks to be able to reach levels where formerly the whites had been at. So in terms of the ownership, I mean, those companies are listed on the stock exchange. People can own shares in them for sure. But one of the big things, sir, that happened within the country was, in order to advance blacks in businesses, there was a system whereby blacks had, I guess the word was preferential treatment when it came to positions, but it had to happen in South Africa. Now when you look at South Africa, you look at some of the CEOs of some of our banks, some of our leading business people, some of our leading educationalists are black people, because they've now not only established themselves, but it's now, they are as good as anyone. And there's no more need for anyone to discriminate against anyone on the basis of the color of their skin. But it did take a lot of time. Apartheid was in place for a long time, and it's still going to take generations for all the scars of apartheid to be removed. But certainly there have been incredible changes within society, and especially in things like business, leadership, education, the universities, all of those places where, it's now really a level playing field and the best person gets the job.
The man in the middle, I know you was one of the guards. I'm trying to ask you, are you the first officer that was with Mandela, or you was the second one?
I was one of the officers which was with Mandela.
Okay.
But Mr. Mandela said he could have counted on his 2 hands the guards become close to him. That's a guards who come from the rural areas, grow up with black people.
Okay.
So I was one of them.
Okay. Because the other question I had heard a pastor from the United States had sat with him in I guess they had a dinner or something, and one of the guards had mistreated him, and when they beated him, they turned around and then he would ask for water, and another guard would urinate on him every time he asked for water.
That's correct.
And so But to go to show you elaborate what you were saying about his character of what he went through, he set that guard right with him with the, I guess they was at a banquet or something, I'm just assuming, but they broke bread. And he told them to bring that guard there and let him sit at the table with him. And they said at that point, the man was shaking so bad, and his entourage was letting him know, Mandela, this, da-da-da. He said, let him stay there. He said, because of the fact I want him to be comfortable, even though he did me dirty, I still forgive him, and I want him to break bread with us.
You know, that happened on Robben Island, but that was in the 60s when Mandela just arrived on the island. That was not specific Mandela, it was one of his comrades. He didn't want to do the job which the guard instructed him. So they take him a hole, they put him in a hole, it becomes very hot that day. When he starts begging for water, the guards go and urinate on him. You know, and that was reported to the International Red Cross a few years later. That guard was immediately moved off the island. And then it happened also one day, Mandela observed a guard when his shirt pulled up a Nazi stuka in front of his arm. And Mandela waited for the minister who visited the prison at that time. And he spread a message to his family that we are guarded by Nazi guards on Robben Island. And then that guard was called in. They removed the Nazi stuka from his arm, and he was transferred. And many years later, in 1983, when he was at Portsmouth prison, that guard worked in the kitchen. Mandela didn't recognize him. He's totally changed. He became bigger and fatter and so on. He changed. Mandela was then in favor with this guard because this guard makes sure his food is always correct. And one day he thanked him for that. When we walk away with the guard said to me, Mandela didn't even recognize me after all these years. I was the one who had the Nazi stuka on him. Then I decided to tell Mandela about that. And when he came back on the section, Mandela said, sir, I must apologize to you that I let you take your Nazi stuka off. But we didn't believe, we were believing you are really Nazi guard, which was on the island. But now today we are friends.
I just want to say what an amazing thing it has been to be able to moderate this conversation. We've got some recognitions that we want to just make around the room. First of all, to Round Room and the Royal House of Mandela for allowing this exhibit to visit the Henry Ford. We feel really blessed to have it here. Secondly, recognition to the Detroit Arts, Culture and Entrepreneurship team and to the Ford Fund for allowing us to have this amazing conversation and bring these two amazing people to our stage. And lastly, to the Ford Foundation for its support of all of our diversity, equity, access and inclusion initiatives here at the Henry Ford. We're really blessed to have that support of some amazing partners. Rochelle Riley, thank you so much for the introduction that sort of grounded us as we began this conversation. If you want to hear more of Christo's stories or Andrew's lessons, have a look at their books, get them signed today. They really are amazing stories and lessons to be learned from there. And if I had one lesson that I've taken away from this conversation, from preparing for this conversation, from reading your books, it is this idea of forgiveness. I couldn't believe it, Andrew, when you brought the word forgiveness up, because what sticks out to me is there is this idea of leading to forgiveness that comes from Mandela's stories, certainly for me. And I don't mean by not acknowledging wrongdoing. I don't mean by hiding things under carpets. I don't mean by, frankly, acknowledging 3 white people talking about Mandela's legacy. Actually, for me, what's really interesting is that I think his life touched the 3 of us and has informed the 3 of us. And that just shows you the power of forgiveness. You see, there is this power when you lead people and you lead yourselves through those difficult conversations, through listening to other people, through hearing the hard words that people have to say to you. And that allows you to get to a place of forgiveness. You can't get to forgiveness without going through those difficult conversations and acknowledging those realities. I actually think in this world today, we could all really benefit from Nelson Mandela's legacy of what I describe as leading to forgiveness. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.